This is Inform Your Resistance with Political Research Associates, or PRA. Tune in monthly to hear experts, researchers, journalists, academics, and movement strategists explain some of the most significant contemporary threats to democracy from the mainstream and far right. With Inform Your Resistance, we distill what you need to know most. I'm your host, Koki Mendes, Communications Director here at PRA. In today's episode, PRA Senior Research Analyst Ben Lorber reflects on the contemporary status of the U.S. Christian Zionist movement, embodied by its largest organization, Christians United for Israel. As the U.S. war on Iran continues, popular support for Israel falters, and influential corners of the far right espouse a vehement critique of Israel premised in a deeply held antisemitism. Ben parses the viability of the movement in the medium and long term, and highlights the growing religious left that is organizing to counter Christian right power. Ben Lorber is a writer, researcher, and movement strategist, and senior research analyst at PRA, where he focuses on antisemitism and white Christian nationalism. He is co-author with Shane Burley of Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting antisemitism. Ben's work has appeared on PBS, NPR, The Nation, The Hill, Jewish Currents, and more. His analysis has been quoted in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and many other outlets. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the pod with me to talk all things Christian Zionism today.
Thanks for having me, Koki. It's good to be here.
All right, let's dive right in. We have a lot to cover. You were just in D.C. this July, attending a powerful action put on by the Interfaith Action for Palestine in response to CUFI, or Christians United for Israel's annual conference. And you are familiar with CUFI's politics and programming from past conferences. Before we dive into the action and the main takeaways, can you give our listeners who may not be familiar with a brief overview of what CUFI is and how it fits into the ecosystem of right-wing movements that robustly support the state of Israel?
Sure. Christians United for Israel is a 10 million member organization that mobilizes pastors and church networks and evangelicals across the country to support the far-right policies of the Israeli government. They have been around since the early 2000s, though their leader, Pastor John Hagee, he's based in San Antonio, Texas. He's a Pentecostal minister who's been holding nights to honor Israel since the 1980s. He's really been always in the hardline, Israel always camp. He has lobbied hard for Israel to expand its illegal settlements in the West Bank. He's lobbied in support of Israel's really series of endless wars in the region, whether against Palestinians in historic Palestine or against Lebanon or Iran and across the Middle East. And Christians United for Israel, it calls itself the largest Christian Zionist organization in the country. And it mobilizes to travel to Congress and lobby elected officials to make their voices heard locally through kind of outreach and building in the cities where they live. And Pastor Hagee is really heavily networked with the Israeli government. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has called him, I'm paraphrasing, part of Israel's national security strategy. He really is the kind of go-to Christian voice in support of Israel. In the months after October 7th, he was the main Christian speaker at the large rally held on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., just to give you an example of the way that he really takes the national spotlight. And of course, like many Christian Zionists, he has his own history of anti-Semitic reasons for supporting Israel. He's a believer in various prophecies that supporting Israel is key to bringing in the end times, a time when Jews and Muslims and everyone who's not an evangelical Christian will be forced to convert or perish. They're hardline anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian. Like much of the pro-Israel right, he sees Palestinians as obstacles at best and as terrorists possessed by Satan at worst. So he's really a leading voice in a movement of Christian Zionists, to be clear. There's tens of millions of Christian Zionists in the country. Most are evangelical, but some aren't. It really runs the gamut of different kind of denominations and streams of beliefs, and the dozens, if not hundreds, of evangelical Zionist organizations. So he's only one in a much broader to the ecosystem, but he is kind of the leading voice. So Kufi's the APAC of the Christian community on Capitol Hill.
That's extremely helpful context, and also interesting to hear that Kufi is one of a network or ecosystem of evangelical organizations that support Israel. What was your overall sense of this year's Kufi gathering? How did it differ from past years? And most importantly, how does IAP's organizing present a counter to Kufi's agenda?
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I mean, this year, I think the Kufi conference is kind of happening at a moment where the pro-Israel right is excited about some things and worried about other things. They're excited and glad that the U.S. and Israel have launched their joint war against Iran in recent months. As soon as the war started, Hagee was delivering sermons at his church in San Antonio, calling it part of end times prophecy, and praising Trump for taking bold and decisive action. And we heard similar things at last year's Kufri conference that was in the summer of 2025. That was shortly after the first attack that Trump launched on Iran. And this time, it's an even bigger reason to celebrate for the Christian right, because the U.S. and Israel have marched completely in lockstep and have embarked on this war with a really unprecedented degree of joint military coordination. And the John Hagees of the world were ecstatic. You heard praise at this conference. The Prime Minister Netanyahu himself televised into the conference and expressed gratitude that the U.S. has backed Israel to the hilt in this war against Iran. At the same time, a lot of the speakers also had a note of alarm and of uncertainty, because in recent weeks, Trump and some American leaders have seemed to back away from offering stalwart support to Israel's most belligerent goals. I mean, months ago, Trump was talking about regime change in Iran, and that's always been what Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli right and the Christian Zionist right have wanted. Pastor John Hagee has long called Iran the head of the snake, right? He's depicted Iran as kind of the lead figure in this global octopus of, to use their conspiratorial framing, of Islamist terrorism, as they would call it. They have really wanted the U.S. to go all in and to support regime change in Iran and to certainly bomb Iran a lot harder. I think they would probably be supportive of ground operations too. But they've been disappointed that the U.S. has not gone this far, and that at least as the time of the conference last week, the U.S. was seemed to be leaning heavier into making a deal with Iran that they would have viewed as very unsatisfactory. They view the current memorandum that's being considered between the U.S. and Iran as worse even than the deal that President Obama signed a decade ago that would have curtailed Iran's nuclear program. They're disappointed in leadership from the White House, and they are also concerned about the base of the right. I think a lot of conservatives have paid a lot of attention to splits on the right in regard to Israel, and we're seeing polling showing that many young conservatives are now not supportive of Israel anymore. I believe it's even broached half, according to recent polling, are saying they're unsupportive of Israel, including among young evangelicals. And this has been a lot of eyes have been on figures like Tucker Carlson, who have turned sharply critical of Israel in recent months, as well as politicians like Thomas Massey or Marjorie Taylor Greene. So at this Kufi conference, they were very much on the back foot. They were railing against podcasters on the right. They were wringing their hands in anxiety that they're losing the next generation. They really had a tone of desperation, and multiple speakers pointed out that, hey, there's a theme in all of our speeches, and everyone was kind of offering different diagnoses as to what went wrong and how they can change, but there wasn't really much of a solution on display. So, they were triumphant in some ways, but they also felt very beleaguered. I think Christian Zionists and other people in the hard-right Zionist camp are worried that they're losing the conservative side. I mean, maybe not in the next couple of years, but in the next generations. So that was kind of the mood at their conference. And then outside of their gates, through the streets of Washington, D.C., we saw this very inspiring gathering and rally, really series of rallies put on by a group called the Interfaith Action for Palestine. This is a coalition of justice-driven groups like Christians for a Free Palestine and Rabbis for Ceasefire and Mennonite Action. There were also a lot of Muslim and Buddhist folks on the ground, and they were really offering up a different vision that was a counter to the religious nationalism on display. They were talking about scripture as presenting a vision of justice and God as a God that stood on the side of the oppressed. And they were directly responding to calls from Palestinian Christians to reject this toxic theology of Christian Zionism. I marched with them, and I was there for their 3-day gathering, which was very songful, very heavy on ritual. There were about 200 of us that were packed into a church near the Capitol for 3 days of breaking bread together, of building art together, and of taking action together. And we protested outside the Museum of the Bible, a Christian nationalist museum in D.C. We protested outside the Heritage Foundation that is behind so many of the policies that are targeting Palestine solidarity activists. And we protested outside Pete Hegseth's a church in D.C. So it really was an inspiring vision of a very different world and a very different vision of faith than that was on display at the Kufi conference.
Thanks, Ben. That does sound really inspiring. I think it's also such a good strategy move to provide religious and spiritual exit for folks whose churches are in support of Israel and a version of Christian Zionism, for people to be able to find a home within their spiritual and religious practice with politics that are more aligned with justice movements and Palestinian liberation. So it sounds very meaningful action. Before we talk about what this shift in tone from Kufi suggests about its strategy moving forward, I want to pause for a moment and pick up the thread that you mentioned around sort of the declining support for Israel within the right-wing base, the U.S. right-wing base. How does Christian Zionism right now intersect with the broader Christian nationalist movement, especially in a moment in which Christian nationalism is ascendant within significant U.S. political power, coinciding with this rapidly declining support for Israel across the U.S. political spectrum?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it really shows that I think we're all used to the story that the American right has always been really solidly marching in lockstep with the Israeli right. And this has been largely true since the 1980s, with the rise of the Christian right that has birthed this Christian nationalist movement that we now confront. So in the late 70s and early 80s, when you had Christian right leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson that burst onto the scene with huge TV audiences and whole networks of megachurches and groups like the Moral Majority. That was an evangelical movement that was really solidly Christian Zionist from the beginning. The support for Israel was one of the main planks of the Moral Majority. It was part of a foreign policy of anti-communism, a foreign policy that said that the U.S. has to support Israel as a beachhead in the Middle East against the Soviet Union. It was very much, a policy of unquestioned global U.S. domination. And then with the war on terror and the rise of the kind of neoconservative post 9/11, the sort of clash of civilizations rhetoric, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel seemed to grow even closer. The U.S. supported Israel as the front line of the Judeo-Christian West, right, in a war on terror against the specter of radical Islam. And this only wasn't on the right, of course. The Democratic Party was largely marching in lockstep as well, even if they would occasionally throw a few crumbs to the idea of Palestinian human rights around the edges. It was very much a bipartisan consensus. And I think we've seen in recent years that bipartisan consensus start to crumble. And it's long overdue, obviously. I mean, those of us who care deeply for a just future in Israel-Palestine know that this change is very welcome, and it's been happening on the Democratic side, certainly. And I think it's surprising us now that it's happening on the Republican side, too. As you said, there's polling showing that large numbers of conservative youth are cooling in their support of Israel. And this has happened before October 7th. Christian Zionists were worrying about this as early as 2021 when polling was showing there's a drop-off in young conservative support for Israel. So it's not a new thing. It also goes back to deep currents on the right. So there have long been paleoconservative and America First factions of the right that just didn't agree that the U.S. needed to support Israel as a way to contain communism in the Middle East, or that after the war on terror you had paleocons like Pat Buchanan who were solidly in the America First camp. He had the slogan America First that has a longer history before him, They were saying that America's position was weakened by supporting Israel, that America should build different alliances in the Middle East, that it was harming America's position on the world stage. And they were arguably correct in some ways. So there's always been this kind of clash in the MAGA movement. And now the Christian nationalist movement, I mean, it's a very diverse movement, right? And we have people at PRA like Fred Clarkson who would caution us against even thinking that Christian nationalism is one unified thing, maybe. There's so many different tendencies, but it's really a divided camp around the question of Israel. You have the kind of Pentecostal and hardline evangelical movements like the New Apostolic Reformation and others who are pretty solidly Christian Zionists. They have their own kind of end times beliefs. Maybe they're a little different than the Jerry Falwells of the past, but they're still pretty aligned with seeing Israel as kind of God's prophetic clock, as they would call it. But then you have other Christian nationalists like Doug Wilson, or people in the kind of more Reformed Calvinist camp, or Tradcaths, the far-right Catholics, who don't have those same theological views that lead them to support Israel, and they are very skeptical. And you're seeing that play out now with people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, who draw from different Christian supremacist streams and are highly critical of Israel. Often there's a lot of anti-Semitism baked in there, but you have anti-Semitism on both sides, really, right? Because the Christian Zionists want to support Israel to bring the end times, and the Christian anti-Zionists don't want to support Israel because they think Jews are damned. So it's really a lose-lose on both sides there. But yeah, that's a bit of the lay of the land for you.
No, that's great. I think also the historical trajectory is really important in both complicating our understanding of the relationship between Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism. Similarly, the historical trajectory gives us a richer picture of the opposition in the way that, as you mentioned, you and Fred really endeavor to do so with complicating our understanding of the Christian nationalist movement as diverse and at odds in some places. Returning to Kufi as sort of the heart of our conversation, and the characterization you give us of this year's conference, sort of a measure of success around the war in Iran, frustration with the now failing peace negotiations with Iran, and not because they're failing, of course, but because they signal a potential end to this aggression, and sort of Kufi's reckoning with the decline in support of Israel within the U.S., especially the U.S. right wing. What is this shift in tone and sort of competing wins and losses characterized by Kufi panelists and speakers suggest about their strategy and their influence moving forward? Is this a nimble organization able to adapt to changing conditions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, first of all, yes, it is a very nimble organization. And it's a nimble movement, really. I mean, since the 1980s, the Christian right has been very adept at playing the inside game and the outside game. They put pressure on so many conservative administrations, and sometimes they've been very happy and pleased. They've also been very disappointed often. There were times when Bush Senior, even Bush Jr. were, in their view, insufficiently supportive of Israel. It's hard for us to believe, but some of those conservative presidents actually pushed back very substantively. At moments like the 1982 Lebanon War and many others, they actually pushed back and threatened to withhold arms sales to Israel, or threatened to tear up the kind of the memorandums of understanding that they had with Israel. There were moments when the right would put real pressure on Israel sometimes, and Christian Zionists were very displeased with that. But they were playing the long game, and they encouraged their flocks to keep on keeping on and to keep building their movement. And that's true for all the issues of the Christian right. It's a movement that has a deep bench and that has built many institutions over the years. Is very well funded, and so they are going to keep putting the pressure on. And we saw recently Miriam Adelson, who's a far-right Israeli Zionist megadonor, a wife of the late Sheldon Adelson, who's a casino magnate. Miriam Adelson got a shout out in the audience at the Kufi conference. She's been to the last several Kufi conferences, and she and others have been recently successful in supporting primary challenges to to Israel-critical conservative candidates like Thomas Massie. And the pro-Israel camp on the right is determined to double down. It really remains to be seen where it's going to go. And I think it would be foolish to say that U.S. support for Israel is going to end overnight simply because there are changing attitudes in the conservative base. We live in a political system where it's very anti-democratic, obviously, especially on the right. So the views of the base are not always going to be reflected in leadership. And if the relationship does change in a meaningful way, it'll likely take years or even generations. So yeah, it remains to be seen. But I do think at the same time, it's notable, I think, that CUFI is losing support. We were on Capitol Hill talking to congressional staffers the morning that CUFI was sending their own people to lobby congressional staffers. And I heard from many young staffers of conservatives, these are 19 and 20-year-olds, they were saying very clearly that they are not into what CUFI is selling. There may be a change on the horizon, but where it goes remains to be seen. And I think it's fair to guess that the median age of the CUFI conference was probably in the 50s or 60s, even though they did put in a good effort to bring some college kids, even high school kids. So yeah, I mean, those voters are going to be around for a while, and they make up the base of much of the MAGA movement. So we'll see, is the short answer, I guess.
Given that context and sort of the both resiliency and determination that you see in the sector of the right, what are some strategic interventions to erode the influence of CUFI and the broader Christian Zionist movement in U.S. and Israeli politics today? And how does countering Christian Zionism play into a broader anti-authoritarian resistance strategy in today's political conjuncture? I know that this is a big question, and I don't expect you to solve the problem of Christian Zionism's influence single-handedly, but I, as a main strategist on the left in this field, I'm really interested in your thoughts here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's been really inspiring in recent years to see the growth of organizations like Christians for a Free Palestine and Mennonite Action that have arisen really from the grassroots to say not in our name or not in God's name, of Christians who want to tell a different story of Christian theology and its relation to Palestine. And there have been long and ongoing efforts in Christian progressive and mainline denominations. Just last week, we also saw the Presbyterian Church General Assembly endorsing impressive new divestment campaigns from some chief war profiteers. So this resistance has been ongoing. I mean, I'm someone who, for over a decade, I've been part of similar Jewish movements like Jewish Voice for Peace. And so I think we're seeing an upsurge of that in the Christian camp. And it's really important, I think, to do this work of visibilizing really the largest American base of support for Israel. I think for attitudes to change in the mass of American society, it's going to take some rethinking of Christian theologies, and it's going to take new voices that are able to rise above the noise. And right now, unfortunately, I think the Tucker Carlsons of the world are speaking louder on this issue than some of the voices on the Christian left. They have bigger platforms. They have better funded platforms. I think the right is way ahead of the left in some ways in building up this kind of alternative media ecosystem. I do think it's really important, everyone, to bring these changing attitudes into an anti-authoritarian direction and not let people like Tucker Carlson capture the narrative. I think groups like Christians for a Free Palestine and many others who have helped lead the way, I think they're going to have to continue, I think, that work. And I think there are a lot of organizations who can speak to different audiences, to mainline and more moderate Christians, as well as to progressive Christians. But I think the bottom line is the mass movements that we've seen in recent years. Since October 7th, there have been mass movements in the U.S. and around the world that have reshaped the conversation. And Israel's defenders know that there's no going back. And so I think it's because of the success that we've already won that we have so many changing attitudes in the U.S. around Israel. And it's important, as you said, to connect that to the domestic fight for democracy and against authoritarianism. It's been really inspiring to see movements like the No Kings rallies take steps to include opposition to the war on Iran. I think we have to find ways to merge the fight for democracy at home to the fight for a just foreign policy, because ultimately they're completely connected and you can't separate them.
Thank you, Ben. I think that is a really clear, not necessarily strategic pivot, but a call to continue the good work that's already happening and a broadening of a religious opposition to Christian Zionism in the United States. Thank you so much for this really fascinating overview of such a deeply important right-wing movement and strategies to counter. And I'm so glad that you are doing the hard work of visibilizing the Christian Zionist movement in the U.S., its broad base of support, and underscoring where power actually comes from in perpetuating the U.S. support for the state of Israel and the right-wing Israeli government.
Yeah, thanks, Koki. Thanks for having me. And everyone listening, thank you for the work you're continuing to do in this time.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for listening to Inform Your Resistance with PRA. Today's episode was hosted by me, Koki Mendes. The podcast is produced by Olivia Lawrence-Weilman, and Frank Lawrence created our music. If you haven't already, rate, review, and subscribe. And if you appreciate our work, please consider donating to Political Research Associates at politicalresearch.org. But the best thing you can do to help us is to tell your comrades about the pod. A shared analysis makes our resistance movement stronger, and we need you to spread the word. Until next time.